we're all set to go.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Karen Engel. I'm a professor of law at the University of Texas at Austin. And along with English professor Neville Hode, I co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. Nearly a year ago, the Rappaport Center's annual conference, which I know a number of people in the audience attended, was on prison abolition, human rights, and penal reform from the local to the global. It was a remarkable conference with activists and speakers from around the globe. Jody Polk organized a roundtable discussion entitled Legal Entitlement as Abolition. And she was joined by Kevin Garrett, Jason Hernandez, David Johnson, and Lauren Johnson in a conversation facilitated by Savannah Kumar, who was then a UT law student and human rights law scholar at the Rappaport Center. We're delighted today that these 6 advocates decided to reconvene to highlight the critical importance of engaging jailhouse lawyers and incarcerated people generally in the current movements for prison abolition and racial justice. Speaking from lived experience and advocacy, the panelists will discuss issues such as legal empowerment, prison and jail conditions, parole, clemency, and re-entry. In September 2019, when we held the first conference, these issues were already urgent. But COVID-19 and the exacerbation of racial disparities brought to the fore by the pandemic and the rapid growth of the movement for Black lives sparked by the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Michael Ramos in recent months has given considerable impetus to police and prison abolitionist causes. Now, we could have convened this webinar before COVID, but we wouldn't have thought to do it. So now that we have thought to do it, to bring people from very different cities back together, and we've really only thought to do it thanks to these panelists who approached us, we hope it will be the first of many sequels to that conference, as well as to other events that we do. So now I turn it over to Neville.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody. I just want to thank our co-sponsorships. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub, the Robert and Helen Bernstein Institute for Human Rights at NYU Law School, ACLU of Texas, Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative, and Texas Jail Project. We would also like to thank Jean-Pierre Vadillo for the artwork featured on the poster, which is for sale if anyone wants to. It's a beautiful piece, if anyone wants to buy it. Vadillo also facilitates activist arts projects with the Austin Justice Coalition here in Austin. Savannah will have more thanks later. I would like to introduce the moderator and chief convener of today's webinar. Savannah Kumar joins us from New York. She is an activist artist. She serves on the board of directors of Truth Be Told, a nonprofit that runs storytelling programs at jail and women's prisons in Central Texas. She holds a JD and a BA in Plan 2 Honors in Philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin. In law school, in addition to being a human rights scholar, as Karen already mentioned, she engaged in numerous activities, including participating in the Civil Rights, Immigration, Environmental Clinics, directing the Getting Radical in the South conference, co-directing the Street Law Program, and a member of the Student Advisory Board for the William Wayne Justice Center for Public Interest Law. It's really nice to see you back here, Savannah, and now it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen and Neville. I'm Savannah, and actually I have the full bios of everyone who will be speaking today and a link that I am sharing with everyone on the webinar now. And I'm actually speaking from Austin, but it doesn't really matter in these days of all being online, so I'm speaking from the internet. All of the panelists have been following and supporting each other's work in the months since we last met, and we're so excited to share about our visions and our work with you today. I just have a few notes and requests here at the beginning of our conversation. First, please note that we do have live closed captioning today. Thank you to Orion, our volunteer closed captioner. If it helps you with accessibility, you can toggle to the top of your screen on Zoom where it says closed captions to turn those on. And we are also streaming live on YouTube on the Rappaport Center's YouTube channel, and it will be recorded so you can watch it or share it with others there as well. Second, whether you're on the Zoom or whether you're on YouTube Live, I'd like to ask everyone to take a moment to type out, if you are comfortable and able, your name. So that's 1, your name, 2, where you're tuning in from, and 3, what brings you to this conversation, whether you're a family member supporting a loved one, a legal worker, an activist, an artist, or just curious about getting more involved. Sharing these things will help us start building community in this online platform. Third, while having this follow-up conversation on an online platform makes it more accessible in many ways than attending an in-person event, it is critical for us to consider who is still barred from being able to be a part of this conversation even today. Those who are behind bars, whether they are in jails, prisons, immigration detention centers, or any other carceral space, are not here with us online to have this conversation with us today, even though their voices are critical to and foundational to this conversation that we're having, and they're actually the ones leading many of the initiatives, crafting many of the ideas and strategies that we're discussing today, and really the impetus behind this work. So as we all know, carceral systems are deliberately working to keep the voices of incarcerated people out of dialogues like the ones that we're having today. In fact, there have been news reports that have come out from directly behind bars about news blackouts and other attempts to keep incarcerated people from participating in these ongoing conversations about racial justice and abolition in a response to the Black Lives Matter protests. So yeah, it just feels important to mention that, you know, if you're watching this, you've likely been on a lot of Zoom calls, have attended a lot of webinars, maybe on racial justice issues or social justice issues. And I invite you right now in this moment on this webinar today, and also in future calls and webinars, to notice which people are structurally barred from joining these platforms, and noticing how necessary and critical and pressing an abolitionist framework is, and how we must work towards a world without the exclusion of these voices. And then just a last couple of things. Feel free to type your questions into the, if you're watching on Zoom, there should be kind of a questions like pop-up that comes up where you can type in your questions that's separate from the chat box. If you're on watching on YouTube, you can put those in to the comments on YouTube. We're going to try to save time to get to some questions at the end, but even if we're not able to get to all of them, it's nice to have a log of them available to see where the conversation is right now and where it might go. And right now, just earlier, I had put into the chat the full links of the bios for everyone. I'm gonna do that now again, so you should have them so that, yeah, you can read more about each panelist. And one other note is, if you're on YouTube, please look for a link sent by Orlando. They are sending the links that I send on the Zoom over to YouTube. And as I said, this discussion is being recorded. So I'll now turn it over to Jody, who organized the original panel on legal empowerment at Texas Law in the fall. Jody is the founder and lead organizer to the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub, home to the Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative. And her work, vision, leadership, and advocacy is the reason that this panel exists today, that it existed in the past. And I'm so honored to learn from her and speak with her today. So all yours, Jody, to speak about legal empowerment and what it means to you and why it's so important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Savannah. It blesses my heart. I'll never forget the feeling that I felt when you all reached out and said, hey, we want you back. And, you know, it's COVID-19. And so it's just like things look different, but I just appreciate you guys' willingness to say this isn't going to stop us. And it's truly because together we center those who are inside, those who are not just affected and impacted now, but who are affected and impacted even last fall when we came through. And so it was amazing. It was just perfect timing, because when we came last fall and we came together at the conference, it was an amazing time, because at that time, the Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative was going through a 7-state law school tour. A year before, we had been doing surveys of jailhouse lawyers nationally across the country, and we were talking to and learning from over 200 jailhouse lawyers. And Texas was one of the biggest states, top states. We chose the 7 top states that we had the most correspondence, worst conditions, and just the loudest cry. So Texas openly responded when we said we want to come through and we want to have, you know, this conversation about jailhouse lawyers in this conversation about legal empowerment. And so when we came through, it was important because we couldn't have had that conversation in Texas if we had not had it with the law school. And I say that because just again, that year before coming to Texas, I had the opportunity to go to Budapest, where I learned about legal empowerment for the first time in my life. And legal empowerment was this process, this understanding of recognizing that people, especially those most isolated, most marginalized, most unprotected by the law, that they should be leading the law, that they should be owners of the law. It was this beautiful idea of taking law away from the hands of, high people in other places and putting it back into the hands of people. And the beautifulness about that was how lawyers were working together with community members, not to just represent them, but to share the knowledge and the power and the resources that they had to make sure that the people most impacted was a healthy, strong participant, leading, driving part of change according to that community's needs in a way that mirrored their time, their respect, their dignity. We talk about sharing power in the United States. We talk about a lot of things in the United States around the criminal justice system, but this was the first time I had the opportunity to see what it looked like. And, especially coming from I live in Florida, but the way the law is, for interpretation. So even when you say the law should protect someone, I couldn't help but think about, okay, the law can look different no matter where you go. And so what I appreciated also about legal empowerment was that it recognized that in order for a person to become a shaper of the law, you had to know the law, to use the law, to shape the law. And that was important, so important for me, because as a formerly incarcerated woman who had returned home from incarceration and was now doing this work and trying to empower my community, there were so many expectations on me. You should join this movement. You should do this. You're Black, you're a woman, you're formerly incarcerated. There were all these expectations about what I should do, but I was just learning about the 13th Amendment. There were moments in my own, for the first time, living my citizenship. I didn't start living my life until in prison, and then after prison. My life was just the data before. And so legal empowerment gave me this opportunity to not just learn a story about my own American history. It gave me the opportunity to put myself in that story and to recognize that not only did I deserve power, but I was the only one who could take it from me. And I was the only one who could give it away. And that was a choice. And so that took a lot of knowing and practicing. Being a jailhouse lawyer in the Florida Department of Corrections, I was a certified law clerk, taught me a lot of things, but I was always surprised at how many people had gotten to prison and didn't realize how they'd gotten there. I was surprised at how many people would come to my desk, how many women I shared life with, that we didn't understand how law and policy even impacted our lives until we were incarcerated. And so it's the first time, unfortunately, to wake up in a jail, in a prison, and find that you're alive, but there I was. And legal empowerment was the strategy. And so the abolition movement has been very sensitive topic for me. That was another movement that I was automatically, expected to join. But there were so many things about it that made me uncomfortable. And so as I watched so many people who were from the inside, people who were not on the inside, rally outside around this need to decarcerate, to end, what we know as the injustice system in America, and much needed, I saw the total disconnect between that same movement happening in prisons and that same movement happening in local neighborhoods. And so at that moment, abolition didn't become a dream. Once I learned about legal empowerment, abolition was no longer a dream. Abolition was so doable. We typically, as abolitionists, say we're imagining a world without police and prisons and jails. And legal empowerment was my strategy for being able to imagine what it looked like, because at its core, it recognized that it would be people knowing and understanding, using and practicing that would influence us shaping and transforming our ugly past into a beautiful future. And so to do legal empowerment with future lawyers at law schools across this country, to do it with a wide range of lawyers and skill sets across this country, but more importantly, doing it with those lawyers that are doing it right now behind bars, doing it with those law clerks, with those jailhouse lawyers, doing it with those justice defenders behind bars. And so what we did last fall was connect the amazing movement that's happening in the prisons and the jails in Texas. It was our first, not the first, because it happens all the time. And that speaks to why we have panelists on this call that are from Texas. I'm just a mouthpiece, but it's already been in Texas. But how can we begin to create a bridge of legal empowerment that connects our legal community, our legal experts, our holders of legal knowledge? How could we then invite them into a movement that really further the knowing and the using, so that we can all together be shapers inside of the law? And so I'm excited to be coming back for round two, and to not just hear about stories. I'm very proud of what the legal empowerment movement looks like internationally. I'm also proud of what the legal empowerment looks like within prisons across this country. And so we're excited to be inviting you as partners and community to join us as we continue to further that bridge.
Thank you so much, Jody. Our next panelist is going to be Kevin Garrett. He's a peer policy fellow at the Texas Jail Project. I'm really honored to introduce him, and he is, the first question that he'll be addressing is, who are jailhouse lawyers, and what do they do that distinguishes them from licensed lawyers, and talking a little bit more about the barriers that they face.
Thank you, Savannah. Can you all hear me?
Sounds good.
Okay, good. Man, it's really good to be back and to see my heroes right there alongside me in the trenches in this war that we continually have to go through. I mean, you guys are truly my heroes. I thought for the longest time that I was the only one that was trying to go through this uphill battle, but it's very comforting to have you guys. So what are jailhouse lawyers? In essence, jailhouse lawyers are people who are inside of the criminal justice system who advocate not only for themselves, but also for others similarly situated inside through the use of a facilities law library. I think for me, I think it's very important that I throw this in there. One of the first obstacles that I had to overcome was not necessarily the system itself or the oppressive nature of things that were going on. It was having to confront that inner doubt within myself. Because again, the criminal justice system is not set up to be all rosy and to make you feel good about yourself. And so, that was the first battle that I had to overcome, not only from some of my fellow inmates, but from the guards, just the system itself. But, after I was able to confront that and face the reality of the situation that I was in, I found it very necessary to obtain information. I needed to get information on how did I get here? How did I end up in this situation that I didn't bargain for, that I didn't ask for? How did I get quote unquote trapped, right? And taking off into that discovery, the first thing that I realized is I've got to get information. I've got to get information to figure out how this happened, And so, it took me a little time inside to realize, but not all information inside is good information. There are a lot of people who will call themselves jailhouse lawyers, but they're not. They'll charge other inmates bags of coffee and stuff like that to give you simple answers, on things. And so it took me a while to realize that secondhand information is not necessarily reliable information. And that's what started me on my quest of finding out the actual laws, as what Jody was saying earlier, to know the law. And for me, in order for me to know the law, I had to get it from the primary source, and that was from the information that was available in the facilities law library. And once I began this process, of my jailhouse lawyer, and I didn't see it as such at the time. It was just that there were so many different things going on that I was so frustrated with, and I just knew deep down inside that this isn't right. And there are too many other people in this same situation who feel the same way. And we were all just lost. We didn't know where to go. And so I started trying to get that information from the law library and to see how I could use it. That meant that I had to have a plan of attack. And for those of you out there in the audience that are not familiar with law library systems that are inside of jails and prisons, your access to that information is very, very limited. In my particular situation, it was once a week. We got 1 hour for once a week to be able to go to the law library. And there were some books, and some of them were, treatises and stuff and things like this. And some of it was outdated, but it was a start for me. And so I realized that through this plan of attack, I would have to really, really use my time wisely. And it was at that point that I stopped watching so much TV. I stopped playing dominoes so much. I stopped crying and moaning about, the conditions inside the jail. And I started narrowing my focus to the actual law, that held me inside of there. And that meant that I would have to put in the work. It takes work and it takes time, but for anyone that's inside of a facility, the time part is not a problem. It should not be a problem. I mean, because what else are you going to do with that time that you have sitting in there? So, once I was able to obtain information, from the law library, and for me, it all began back in 2004 when I had my court-appointed lawyer that just was not advocating for me. He was just plain and simply trying to get me to plead guilty to something that I felt I wasn't guilty for. And so I used the only legal document that I had on hand that I could possibly attack. And this was before I had any experience with the law and how to research or anything like that. The only document that I had to use to attack was my indictment. And I noticed right away, there's a culpable mental state there that said that I intentionally and knowingly deprived the owner of a piece of property. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I did not intentionally do anything. And from that point on, I was able to pull information, off the shelves, whatever that they had available on culpable mental states. And from there, I started attacking. And that attack took the form of many, many letters. As a jailhouse lawyer, jailhouse lawyers don't have access to courts like licensed lawyers on the outside do. But I did have access to the US mail. And so what I would do is every time I found something that I thought would be useful to my case, I wrote the prosecutor, I wrote the judge, and I wrote my lawyer. And this did not make any of them happy, but the bottom line is my voice was finally heard, through the use of that law library and the resources that I had available there. I always like to be sure that anyone that's not familiar with jailhouse lawyering or anything like this type of uphill battle is that it's very, very important to work within the confines or within the parameters, if you will, of what you have available. You can't try to fight the police department, fight the unsanitary jail conditions and fight your case at the same time with no real access to the courts. So you have to, work within the parameters that you have given. So my next question that I thought was interesting, and it's very important, is what distinguishes a jailhouse lawyer from a licensed attorney? Well, to put it simply, a licensed attorney cannot relate to an inmate the way that a jailhouse lawyer can. Jailhouse lawyers are peers. They're peers. They're people who have the same lived experience as others that are inside of there. And they have learned how to, such as what's my case, you've learned how to navigate the system. Again, using the example that I just used just a minute ago, You know, you can't fight the jail, the police, and your case at the same time. And so a jailhouse lawyer would be able to not only demonstrate that through what he or she does on the inside, but he will be able to communicate that and communicate it more effectively to others on the inside who are curious as to how they ended up in this situation, how they might be able to help themselves to get out of this situation. So a jailhouse lawyer is like a guide. He or she is also like a counselor on the inside. You know, there are a lot of people on the inside who don't have a clue as to what the law is, how the law works. I mean, I've seen far too many people that cop out, what we call cop out, you know, plead guilty to a charge that was nowhere close to the facts that they present to me, you know, because they didn't feel like they had any choice, you know, and their licensed attorney didn't present it to them as if they had a choice. And so they would plead guilty to something that probably was a misdemeanor and end up getting a 10-year sentence. And so that's where a jailhouse lawyer, and a licensed attorney are very, very different, very, very different in that respect. One of the other questions that I had presented to me is, what are some of the barriers for people who have been formerly incarcerated to try to get a license to practice law? Well, I could give you the Cliff Notes version of this and just say there are many. There are lots of barriers. I mean, the system is not exactly set up to help people once they get out, you know, and that's in any realm, but especially if you're asking to become a licensed attorney in the same state where you were formerly incarcerated. They have rules in place and things like that. But again, you know, going back to what I said earlier, you know, the biggest barrier that I faced particularly was overcoming the doubt. I mean, I was told for so many years that I can't do this. There's no way that I could ever be a lawyer because I have felonies on my record now. And so I figured, well, my next best shot would be to be a paralegal. And so I started taking classes to become a paralegal. And my classmates who were pre-law students, I was running circles around them, and I started reaching out and I started asking other people, hey, is it possible? Is it possible? And I found out that, yes, it is possible. So my advice to anyone out there about these so-called barriers is that, you know, just because you've never seen it before, just because it has never been done before, doesn't mean that it's impossible. It doesn't. I mean, you just have to, going back to what I said earlier, you just have to realize that it's going to take some time and it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work. Now, I could, you know, I could be on this panel and I could say, well, yeah, the State Bar of Texas is this and the Board of Law Examiners is that, and that rule is wholly unfair and everything. But, you know, that's to me, that's really a waste of time. I think it's really up to the individual. How bad do you want it and how hard will you work to get it? You know, so, you know, that's my little deal on the barriers. I mean, there are many of them, and it is definitely an uphill battle, but it's doable. It's doable. It just takes time and work. So lastly, the last little point that I would like to bring up, because in the interest of time, it looks like I'm running out, is how abolition works in the context of county jails. That is, people who are being held pretrial. I think it's most important that, like, what the work that Texas Jail Project is doing and other small nonprofits like us is doing is that we realize that, you know, we're going up against a system. It's going up against the system. And though we help people, you know, on a day-to-day basis, we help families and things like that, we are going up against the system. And it sometimes you have to be content with the little bitty wins when you can get them, and not get discouraged, and not, you know, and not want to give up, you know, and you just keep chipping away at it. You keep chipping away at it, And sooner or later, we'll get there, you know, with the help of the ACLU of Texas and the Texas Fair Defense Project, the Hall Foundation for Mental Health, and other nonprofits who are interested in this kind of work. You know, we all just have to work together and use our voices and our power collectively to chip away at that system. Chip away at that system, is eventually we'll get there. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I feel so honored that you're a law graduate, and it makes my experience as a law grad mean so much more knowing that you are, and that you're working towards being a licensed attorney right now. And the legal profession is so lucky to have you serve in that role, and that you've already done so unimaginably much already. Next, we have Jason, who's going to be speaking. He was a President Obama Clemency recipient, a Soros Justice Fellow, and he is an author of a book, Get Clemency Now. And I'll be sharing resources and ways for you to access that work soon too. So I'll turn it over to you, Jason. And actually the first question that we have for you is why clemency is necessary for abolition.
Well, to me, clemency, when you look at it and when you compare it to where we are today with mass incarceration, the policies and the laws that were passed, of course, it was a group of people who came up with all those mandatory minimums and the abolishment of parole. But at the end of the day, it came down to a signature, whether of a governor or of a president, right? So when you look at clemency as well, the president and majority of governors, through the stroke of a pen, right, they were able to issue this destruction throughout our communities of the United States. But also through just the stroke of a pen, they can give these individuals their life back. They can give these individuals their rights back. And that's when that's how I kind of correlate clemency and where we're at today. We do look at clemency as well as far as redemption and second chances and forgiveness to the people that are incarcerated. But I look at clemency as a way for the government or for the states to redeem themselves, right? To forgive themselves and to make what they did that was wrong, to make it right again. So then that way it's kind of like how would you say, a double-edged redemption, because again, the states, the government, they need to be held accountable. They need to acknowledge what they did back in the 80s was not based on reason or sound judgment or research, but just kind of out of fear and some type of hysteria that was going on in the 1980s. But now through research and studies, we know that these laws were not justified. So again, I think that with clemency, it's not just about showing forgiveness or redeeming the person that's incarcerated, but here's a great opportunity for the states and for the government to redeem themselves, right, and to make what was wrong right, and a second chance for kind of this reunification of like an olive branch being given back out to the community, saying we were sorry for what we did. We didn't know any better, but we want to make it right, and clemency is part of that process. There's several ways that need to be reformed, but clemency is a great way to go about it initially.
Great, thanks, Jason. And then you recently published Get Clemency Now. I know we'd all really love to hear about both the process of that, and if you could just tell us about, why you wrote it and how you hope advocates will be using that going forward.
Yeah, well, Get Clemency Now, it was I guess you could say it was 10 years in the making. Probably 10 years when I learned about clemency back in 2010, but it encompassed everything that I learned when I was a jailhouse attorney when I entered prison back in 1998. So there's around 18 years of actual prison experience in there, and the last 5 years of experience as well as doing clemency all in this book, all in one book. And I designed it and I created it for that individual who is incarcerated. I mean, this is a book for people that are in prison, and not just that people that are in prison, because again, it's not like you can just go to the law library whenever you want. I wrote this book for that individual who was on 23-hour lockdown, who was on death row, who couldn't leave their cell, just like they can't right now under this COVID situation that we're going in. There's a 200-page book. all in the back, there were actual documents that I did, actual clemency petitions that we did that help people get out of prison. There's letters to President Barack Obama, to senators, to the ACLU. There's profiles in there that were the actual ones that I created when I was incarcerated, done with the broken typewriter, done with, if I didn't have glue, that were stapled together or were put together with toothpaste. They are in there. And again, it's not just designed for people that are incarcerated, but it's also designed for the mothers, for the grandmothers who don't know nothing about clemency, don't know nothing about what's going on inside prison, don't know how to use social media, because not only does it teach you how to do a robust clemency petition, it teaches you how to advocate, right? How to do visuals, how to lobby, how to meet with senators or House of Representatives. It's everything that you need is in this book. And not only just for the people, again, it's designed for people that are incarcerated and their families, but I would love to see it used by law schools, law clinics. Actually, this past year, I was working with one of your rivals, Texas A&M, right here in Fort Worth with their law clinic. And we were able to secure the release of a lady who was doing a 20-year sentence for marijuana, Crystal Munoz, and President Trump released her. There was Alyssa Castillo, who was serving life without parole, a 64-year-old grandmother, through the help of Texas A&M. Sorry, I keep mentioning their name, but would love to see more schools, more colleges get involved. There are several across the United States. From my understanding, I think Texas A&M might be the only one in Texas. I do feel that UT, being at the heart of Texas, being in Austin, being close right there by the capital, that you can have such a huge impact on clemency. And as well, I designed this book, and it's free. You can go to www.getclemencynow.org. You can view it, you can download it for free. You can purchase it if you want. But I created it, and I'm pretty sure all the law students will agree with me, right? I read every book, and in prison we had books. We didn't have Lexus, Nexus, or whatever you want to call it, right? We had these big old thick books, right? Fed second, Fed third, Fed sub second, every book that you can name of, right? And I read just about every single one of them. And I read all these law guys, all these different books that teach you about habeas corpus, direct appeals, 3582 C2s, Rule 60Bs, read every single one of them. And I used to dread reading these books, right? They're just so boring, but you have to read them. This book, I created it with I wanted the individuals that held it to feel that it was powerful, because it is, to let these individuals know that they don't have to wait around for an organization or for Kim Kardashian to come around and hopefully help them get out of prison, that they can do it themselves. So yeah, the book, there's a lot in there. Also, it's just not my creation. Working with students, working with grandmothers, working with kindergarten teachers, also NYU Law School, St. Thomas Law School. All this information is in this book, and it's everything that you need to know about clemency. Whether you're in prison, whether you're in law school, whether you're an attorney, this book has it for you.
Thank you so much. And I would have loved to have that when I was in law school, but I'm so excited that so many others already have access to what you've created, and that so much will grow from it. The last thing I want to ask you about is, and you've touched on this, but if there's really one thing that you feel like people should know about the challenges of advocating behind bars, maybe from an experience that you had, or just something that you feel like people should know about that experience, if you could share that with the rest of the group.
Well, what I want people to understand is that you have these amazing minds that are incarcerated, right? Some of the greatest people that I ever met were in prison and still are in prison. And these individuals, they might be in there for drugs. These jailhouse attorneys might be in there for drugs, but they're just not working on drug cases. A jailhouse attorney might be in there for robbery, but he's just not focused on robbery cases. And these jailhouse attorneys do every case that you can possibly think of, right? Whether it's violent, non-violent, drug offense, divorce, child custody, that there is no, well, I won't represent you because that's a violent crime, or I won't represent you because you don't have enough time. That these jailhouse attorneys, they are the overseers of that entire prison, right? Whether it's criminal justice or what's going on, whether it's police guard brutality or retaliation that's happening to these individuals. But I I want law schools, right? I want y'all to understand this, and not just law schools, but everybody, that everybody looks, if you look, and especially if you look at this panel here right now, people who were directly impacted are at the forefront of any type of criminal justice movement. I don't care what it is, that we have a voice there. But we also need to make sure that we give those individuals who are in prison a voice too. That we just can't rely on them and just say, well, we need a heartfelt story, or we need some compassion, and let's highlight a story of an individual that's in prison. We can do more than that. They can do more than that. But you just gotta have to reach out to them and give them that opportunity to do so. Again, just don't use them for a good story or for a face of a project. Utilize them. Use their input. Let them do the research for you. Formulate documents. What needs to be changed? What needs to be amended? So that's what I would do. I mean, for the people that are incarcerated, the struggles in there, if you want to help them, let them be a part of the process. Like they say, nothing for us without us, and that applies to those individuals that are incarcerated right now.
Thank you so much for that. So true. So next we have Lauren Johnson, and Lauren is a policy advocate strategist at the ACLU of Texas. And one question that we have for her is, how can we push for criminal justice reforms while also pushing for abolition?
Hi, Savannah, thank you. So so before I start into that, what I want to say is, like, as we've been hearing from my colleagues here that are amazing, we've been talking a lot about law libraries and legal research and jailhouse lawyers. And I've been thinking a lot about the ways that most of the time when you hear terms like that, it is connected to people who have already been sentenced and who are already in prison. And I flash back to my own experience being in a county jail, and had some time on my hands to try to figure out like how to do some work on my own behalf, because the attorney that I had certainly was not going to. Texas county jails are required by law to provide legal resources to the people who are incarcerated there. But there's not a strong definition of what that has to look like, what that access looks like. And so, for me in that moment, it was, you write a question and somebody else will do some research, and maybe next week you'll get some printed sheets that will maybe answer your question, but usually doesn't answer your question. And so, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the ways in which our system is created so that, like, your best chance at fighting a case is on the front end, because once you've been convicted, it is not impossible, but it is really hard, and it takes a really long time. Even if you look at all of the wrongful convictions, exonerations that happen, those things take 20 years, 10, 20 years for people to get their lives back when they've been wrongfully convicted. And so I'm thinking a lot right now about the ways that when people don't have access to legal resources on the front end, how much time it costs them from their lives, and how we could bridge that gap to actually create. I know Helen Gabler had written a question in the chat about how can law schools help, and I think that maybe that's a gap that we could look into filling, is how do we support people in county jails that maybe don't have strong access to the resources that exist there. So that's just kind of an aside. The question that you asked about how do we do reform as it relates to abolition. And I think, for a long time, I would say that I wasn't quite an abolitionist, but I wanted to be. And I think I largely said that because maybe I didn't clearly, I didn't have an understanding of what a lot of abolitionists view as abolition. And so over time, like I used to say, well, I want to envision a world where we actually deal with the problems without just locking people away, right? Because prisons don't actually solve any of the problems that people are sentenced there to solve. It just warehouses people. And so when I think about, how do we create a world where we don't need that? And it is all front end stuff, right? It's all the things that we're hearing kind of come to the forefront of the conversation around defunding the police, right? It's police are responding to crimes after they happen. How do we prevent them in the first place? And that means giving people access to the resources that they need, access to a legitimate job market, access to education, all of those things, mental health, substance use treatment. And I think that when you talk about abolition or strong words like defund the police, it scares a lot of people because this is the only system that they understand, and they don't know how the world would operate if we didn't have these systems in place, what happens when harm is created in our communities. And so I think that that's exactly how reforms fit in, is because as people that don't have, that don't swim in this world, don't have a strong understanding of how any of that could work. And I think when we start talking about reforms, it gives people an opportunity to dip their toe in the water of understanding the lives and perspectives of the people that have come into contact with the criminal justice system. It gives them an opportunity to think critically about how this system came to be in the first place and who it impacts in the most egregious ways. And all of that is information that your average person isn't thinking about in general. And so when we are doing reforms, it offers an opportunity for people to think about even a small piece of the puzzle, and gives them also the opportunity to start expanding their knowledge around that.
Great, thank you. And could you tell us a little bit about, in the work that you do now, how you amplify the voices of people behind bars in what you do? And also, you mentioned that talking about reform can be a pathway to then talking about abolition. So just any examples or success stories you have of helping people get into the door on those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things, right? When I think about, I'm sorry, hold on just a second. So amplifying the voices of people behind bars, I think that this is a complicated question, right? Because we've got such a huge, massive system, and it's just flooded with problems. I get, the ACLU gets mail, I get personal mail all the time. There's a million egregious things that are happening to people inside of our jails and prisons, and it's so hard to make any of those things bubble up to the surface as the worst, because it's just so many things. And so I think the question that I want to answer instead is saying that what we need to do to be able to include these people in talks about abolition, talks about reform, and doing advocacy from the inside is just providing the support and resources. And kind of back to what Kevin had said earlier, reminding people how capable that they truly can be. I think a huge issue for folks who are incarcerated is, you've been beaten down through whatever brought you to the prison, and then you're beaten down your entire time there, and you don't have a lot of faith in your ability to make good decisions. And as an example, we did some stakeholder meetings at the Travis County Jail 2 years ago, where we went in and asked the women, like, what did they think they needed? What does a model facility look like to them? And it became apparent to me in 3 separate groups, these women, we told them to dream big, and they said, oh, if I could work for deodorant. Oh, if I could have fresh fruit, if we could have pads with wings, if we could work for a bra. Like, these were, every single group of women talked about their most basic needs. And when you're talking to people about transforming their lives, you're not going to get anywhere until their most basic needs are met. And so, when we would challenge the women to think larger than their most basic needs, they would hit a wall, and they would say, well, we're not supposed to like it here. It's supposed to make us not want to come back. And the problem with that is that doesn't work. All of the women who said that had been there multiple times. And I said, so what does it look like if a system supports you into success instead of punishing you away from failing? And yeah, now I'm down a rabbit hole, and I'm not probably answering your question at all, but it's just the thing that I think of is people cannot do major transformation of their lives when they don't have their most basic human needs met.
Thank you. And one other question for you. We have a couple more minutes for you. So we've both been involved with Truth Be Told. I'm actually not on their board anymore, but I have been, and I know you've had experiences with them both behind bars and in the advocacy that you do now. And I was wondering if you could share, as you're talking about basic needs, is there anything that you kind of had with you either behind bars or now either from Truth Be Told or another resource that helps you kind of stay grounded when those basic needs are hard to meet that you would be willing to share with the group? Like
I'm at a place in my life where I feel like community is the answer to everything. And I think that that is something that I brought with me from jail. I think especially in women's facilities, what you see is that women create families for each other in there. That the people who are going to help you are not the guards, or, you know, if you're having a medical emergency, don't count on a guard to come save your life. It's going to be the women that you're incarcerated with. And similarly, they're going to provide emotional support. They're going to carry you when you're falling apart because your family, something is going on outside. And I think, you know, it all connects with like the work that Truth Be Told does, but also just, you know, I did a leadership training, and the executive coach for the training was amazing. He was like a Jan Van Zandt on steroids. And he would, occasionally somebody would throw him a curveball question, and he was wholly capable of like challenging them and coaching them through it. And instead he would say, anybody else in this room have that problem? And 15 hands would go up. And he'd say, great, I want you to talk to 4 of those people. And that was it. That was his answer. And I always thought he was copping out, but the more I thought about it, and then I read Peter Block's book, Community, The Structure of Belonging. And I really thought about the ways in which, like, when you go and reach out to your community, maybe they have a solution, but even if they don't, now you're not alone in your problem anymore. And it doesn't seem as insurmountable anymore. And so I think that community is the answer. You know, when we're going through hard times in prison, when you're coming out, when you're trying to find resources, all of those ways, like it is really all about plugging into your supportive community. We all know that on some level, because all of the things that we do in our lives that we're successful in, whether it's good or bad, requires a community to help us do it. And so that's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we have David Johnson, who's actually on the road and was able to still make it here with us today. So David, thank you so much for being here. And our first question for you is, how does the police and prison system exacerbate people's struggles with mental health or substance abuse? And if you could just speak a little bit more about that. And
did you say a little bit more? Thank you for having me. They exacerbate those issues by existing in the forms that we know them. Like, to give you a simple answer, here's the thing: those institutions are harmful. We can like, I'm not going to do anybody's extra work for them right now. Everybody can go online and look up how policing is a genetic descendant of slavery. People can track how imprisonment is a genetic descendant of slavery. And people like to get caught up on things like, oh, well, but white people go to jail. Look, it's like dolphins. The net is for tuna. If a dolphin gets caught, they are not wasting their time trying to save its life. It's just caught up and shouldn't have been in the waters. And that's really how it plays out. And so these institutions have historically harmed, I would say, in a rough order, Black, female, Black and poor, all poor, Black, female, non-binary, all the way through. These systems are set up to harm anyone who is not a white American naturalized citizen or natural born citizen, English speaking, like the whole, all of the harm that's wrapped up in words like citizen and concepts of legal and illegality with regard to a human being's existence. Everything from being locked up for drugs to being locked up because you lack the appropriate status, immigration status, all of those things track all the way back to racist harm. So when we're looking at it today, why would we think that the harm would be any different? It's just expanded. I say regularly to people, whenever you start cracking open oneism, be careful, because all of the other ones will come spilling out. So we look at, I could go technically and say, hey, if you look at the DSM, it says that post-traumatic, it defines PTSD as an illness and identifies, like, the only prerequisites are that someone has to deal with a stressful situation that has a very real threat of harm to them or someone else, and that it has to be chronically recurrent. I don't know anything that better encapsulates that than policing and imprisonment. And so when you then factor in the fact that they've already proven that chronic stress increases the probability of symptomatic mental illness. And let's talk about it as behavioral health, because that covers substance use disorder, trauma response, or like trigger trauma response to those experiencing trauma and mental illness. I don't know anyone who has done drugs for an extended period of time who either didn't start off with a diagnosable mental illness or didn't finish with one. If you go long enough and don't quit, that's what happens. And so I think when you factor into the numbers, the way that policing and prison harm and traumatize individuals, the way it breaks up the social foundation, it destroys families, it creates entirely new concepts of stress, new forms of stress that had before been unknown to individuals. As Lauren pointed out, that how in prison women form communities. We've been giving them the answers from the beginning. Whenever they would ask people who joined gangs, why did you join? Because they offered me some type of feeling of belonging or family. Yet we've always, as a culture, ignored that and believed that the fault lie at the heart of the individual who's screaming out and crying for help and saying, I just fell into this because I didn't know what else to do. Prisons and policing create a lot of, I don't know what to do. And as a result, I'm left at the mercy of these systems kind of dynamic. And so I would argue that every person who has ever been arrested, imprisoned, or witnessed or experienced a loved one being arrested or imprisoned would probably qualify for PTSD diagnosis. And thus, I think the entire country has been mentally harmed as a result of policing and imprisonment.
Thank you for sharing that. And then could you just speak a little bit more about how we can include people who are currently incarcerated in a framework towards abolition, when the whole system, like you said, is really keeping them down and making it so difficult for them to access it? What are the strategies that we can use to still include those voices?
So I will say this, since we are already having these very blunt conversations on a global level about anti-Blackness, any other conversation should be easy at this point. So how do we need to? We need to have individuals, preferably white individuals who have never been to jail and have all of the letters after the comma that follows their last name as you can give them. They can be MSWs, LCDCs, PH, I want all the letters, I'm here for it. We need those individuals to stand up and say, you know what? Here is who you need to speak to. Here is whose voice you need to hear. Because if we're not calling people up to do the same thing that we're asking them to do with regard to discussions of anti-Blackness and how that permeates our society, then really we're duplicating the same failed systems. We're having people stand in our stead to speak our truths on our behalf. And let me tell you, I haven't been in prison in over 10 years. So while I may be put up on a podium and told, hey, speak that truth, my truth is a decade outdated. Like, I don't get to own the narrative. I've never done more than 5 years flat in prison. So my narrative doesn't serve the narrative for those like Kevin who did more time than me, or Jace or Lauren. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is just a real thing. We have to stop treating individuals who have first off, we have to stop treating individuals who have experience with incarceration and detention. Let me name that, because we keep talking about incarceration and imprisonment, and they got us to buy this nonsense lie that says that the criminal justice system and the immigration system are two separate systems, when really they're like this. Either way you paint it, it is white supremacist America saying, hey, if you are poor or brown, here's where you go instead until we deem otherwise. And as long as they keep us believing that these are separate issues instead of different faces of the same globe, we will continue to have these struggles. But I want to say that when we involve people's voices, we have to call out and say that, like, our voices are not completely as relevant as they need to be. And I would also lift up that as a formerly incarcerated person, it took a lot to convince me to have faith in any mode of changing the system. You know what I'm saying? Like, the first Black person I ever saw get out of anything was OJ. And the first Black person that I saw later on in life really give it to the system was Angela Davis, when she acted as her own attorney. And see, that's something we look back to when we talk about abolition, but I want to like break that down. There is a Black woman saying, I would rather go to prison for the rest of my life because I failed myself than to trust myself to a system that will absolutely fail me. And that is something that a lot of people, including myself, have not had the integrity or the courage to do. I will say that I have pled for things I didn't do because I knew that my previous record screwed me. And then I look at her example and I go, maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I should have invested that 10 to 20 years, as Lauren outlined earlier, that it's going to take, or like Jody outlined earlier, it's going to take for me to get out of it. But you know, say sacrifice is never convenient. But I looked at her and it's like, there was a Black woman had the odds stacked against her, defended herself, and used her brain as a weapon. And that is something that we don't celebrate in this culture, but we should, because that shows the importance of access to information and knowledge. That's why I'm so happy that Jason did what he did and is doing what he's doing, because there is taking a bunch of knowledge and giving it away free and making it accessible. At the end of the day, the reason we're still talking about abolition is because we as a community are still enslaved. The enslavement has just been expanded and redefined. But they are still putting us to unpaid labor in prisons, but then they enslave us nutritionally by keeping quality supermarkets out of our, and fair price supermarkets out of our neighborhoods, economically by making sure that we are not able to acquire professional licenses, and we are limited to work blue collar jobs. Housing wise, we are treated with injustice because we cannot move into any place with our record unless the owner feels good for us or we get in on somebody else's name. Like, there are all of these levels of intersectional slavery that still demand the abolition movement. The abolition movement never stopped. White supremacist America gave us 3 amendments and thought that that cleared it up. And then almost a century later, they got a racist Democrat, LBJ, to step up and say, hey, I'm racist, but this is horrible. We need to do something about that. And they thought that that was going to put a stop on it. But no, it isn't a stop. So what we need to do is we really need to start expanding the power of those who are incarcerated. In Texas, you can vote once you're done with parole. That isn't true everywhere. We as a community of formerly incarcerated persons should be rallying to make sure that every person formerly or currently incarcerated can vote, especially since failing to do so only encourages the belief system that if you are convicted of a crime, you deserve to lose all decision-making human rights. And that's just not something I can sign up for, and I don't think any of us can.
David, thank you so much. And actually, exactly to your point on amplifying the voices of people who are incarcerated, I want to highlight in the chat, we have Krish, who has someone who is incarcerated on the phone, who's been listening to this conversation. And Krish has kind of put out in the chat some of the things that this person who's been using his minutes to listen in on this conversation has shared. I'm going to just read out a little bit of them, just because if this is the best that we can do to try to get those voices on the line, we can at least try to do that. And I'm going to put the rest in the chat so that you can all see it in one place. But I'm going to read out just a little bit. So if this person is still on the phone, they know we hear them and we are, we're with them. So these are the messages that I have gotten from Christian that everyone can see in the chat. I've been here since March, have not had any court date. We are not treated as innocent until proven guilty. Here we have to sit on one side of the table and my attorney and the prosecutor sit on the other side of the table. What does that say about the system? And we never get to see the evidence against us, never. Here in this jail, it's worse than state prison. They put us in this horrific restraint chair, which gets rolled out so no one can hear us. One man kicked a door because he was refused a toilet paper. They strapped him in a restraint chair and left him outside for 12 hours. We couldn't bear to hear him scream. It's torture here. County jail is worse than prison. And just today, a 70-year-old man had to take 15 months after taking a 2-year sentence for having to leave the restitution house with permission to go bury his wife who died during this pandemic. The court-appointed attorney did nothing to fight the second sentence. It's like they live off the time they suck from our lives. I've been helping people write letters to attorneys for folks who can't. I've written 27 motions so far. They just take the motions and do nothing with it. Our attorneys don't do anything to help us. They won't even explain to us what's going on. They do not have our best interests at heart. We shouldn't be afraid of the attorneys, but we are. Why should we be afraid of our attorneys? It's not right. So I just wanted to read that out. We got that in the chat. And again, in reimagining possibilities, I hope that we can have a world where we don't have to just be reading these voices out from a chat, but instead we can all be in a room together having these conversations. But in the meantime, thank you all for dreaming beyond what appears to be possible and actually making this a conversation that's transcending bars right now. So just a bit more before I'm going to transition it back to Jody in a moment, and she's going to share a call to action, and then we'll do questions. But I wanted to share that, I graduated from law school just a few months ago, but I credit my legal education completely to the incarcerated organizers at a prison in California that I met when I was 18, when I was a teenager, who invited me to actually go behind bars and support a project that they organized to support young people who had experienced violence and were healing from trauma in their community. And so it was that education that I credit to, who I am and the ability to dream and to really reach towards this shared vision of freedom and healing and forgiveness and joy. And I feel like every step that I've taken in life has come from that power behind bars and that wisdom that people were willing to be vulnerable and share with me when I was a teenager. And I just wanted to share that of the immense power that's in those spaces and how important it is to bring that back out, and how important it is for all of us. Sometimes the education systems or the institutions that we're in don't give us that space to look to the people who've had these real experiences of the problem and see them as who they are, people who are organizers, who aren't just, in law school, you do pro bono with clients, but people aren't just clients, they are organizers, and they can be organizers. So to really see them as that. And to that end, I'm going to be sharing with you in the chat, and Orlando will pass it on YouTube Live, a link to some resources that include, for example, like Jason's Get Clemency Now book, and a little bit about projects that everyone has been working on, so that you can share that with your community. And then one other thing that I'll put in the chat / will go on YouTube Live will be a form to stay involved. If you want to continue staying involved with legal empowerment work, you can do that, and you can sign up on this form. And so those are just a couple ways that we can always push our education beyond. No matter where we are, we can always do everything that we can to listen and amplify the voices that don't appear to be in the room. So sharing those, and I will pass it on to Jody to do a call to action.
Yes, thank you so much, Savannah. For everyone on this call, in addition to being a legal empowerment practitioner, I'm a community peace builder. And so we can imagine all of the things that people need, but I also love what Lauren and both David, what we all brought up is people also need connection. People also need hope. People also need, all these things that it feels hard to get. And I couldn't help but on this call recognizing that I hate to call them panelists, but all of my friends and partners is that Jason is the truth. That lie told him that he'd never come home, and he is living truth. Kevin is hope. My whole journey, people can see me as all kinds of activists, and you can read my bio. It came from one dream when I stepped out of prison. I wanted to be a lawyer because I knew I was a lawyer. I'm still fighting to be a lawyer, and Kevin's my hope. Lauren is power. Power. I met Lauren in the movement fighting for women and girls, and I am just amazed at just the power that she brings to not just her work, but her life and everyone else. When you're around Lauren, immediately you're set free to be yourself and not anyone else. And then David brings humanity. Humanity. What you're talking about, David, is the freedom of being yourself in the midst of chaos. That to me is the definition of peace, not the absence of justice, not the absence of tension, like Dr. Martin Luther King told us, but the presence of justice, humanity, peace. And so it's right here. Sometimes the answers feel so far away. The Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative is a national project. And so we look at 3 important goals that we cannot do without everyone on this call, both directly impacted, indirectly impacted, non-impacted, all those titles. We're just community members. So how can we break down all those layers that separate us from sharing in this life, which is power together? And so the first goal that we have at JLI is making sure that every prison across this country that has a law library with law clerks, that those law clerks are getting adequate training that is actually relevant to the diversity of needs. They're not just doing post-convictions, they're doing divorces, they are doing loss of licensing, they are doing immigration, they are doing conditions of confinement, they're doing civil issues. Life doesn't stop. And so working with lawyers right now, JLI is working with the law students at NYU and the Bernstein Institute. And we've been working to ensure that law clerks in New York get what they need. We're proud to be working with law students at FSU right now for the first time in our state to produce a full law clerk training that meets the requirements of those individuals in Florida. Because when we did the research, it's different everywhere. So how are you making sure that the people where you are getting the priorities based off their needs? So law students working with formerly incarcerated and incarcerated jailhouse lawyers and justice defenders to make sure that we have what we need. You can do that any state that you're in. You can begin organizing and pulling that together. I'm sure Jason points that out in our book, How to Do That, in his book, How to Do That. Second call to action, making sure that law libraries are restorative places where people can be legally empowered, making sure that the individuals, the law clerk in itself shouldn't be the only source of power. How all lives being governed and ran and equipped in ways that allow people to grow their legal identity, to allow people to experience law and policy. So many people, for the first time, they're experiencing it in the jail or the prison. As Lauren was saying, how can we make sure that what people need is where they are? And so if the data shows us where they are, how can we move into those spaces? And a lot of times when you're formerly incarcerated, they don't let you back in. So we need you. And then that third around advocacy. How many jailhouse lawyers do I know right now with life sentences needs Jason's book, won't hear about Jason's book? Get Jason's book. If you want to know somebody on the inside and you want to get that book and send it to one of the hundreds of jailhouse lawyers that we have doing life, trying to answer questions that he answered in a book, we would love to tell you someone that you could purchase the book for. Get in that book, supporting Jason's work. Also participatory defense, there are movements, reach out to us. We love, if you're in a state, we love to let you know, not just the Jasons and the Kevins and David and the text, regardless where you are, there's people on the ground doing a work, been doing the work. We love to connect you to those folks, both inside and outside, so that your community where you are can expand to meet the needs of the people where you are. So please reach out to the Legal Empowerment and Advocacy Hub. We love to connect you with partners through the Jailhouse Lawyers Initiative in the states that we're connected to, or we love to connect you to our wide just partnerships that exist through the state of people who are leading both from the inside and outside.
Thank you, Jody. And that answered some questions that were in the chat about what people can be doing to get involved now and how people who are on the outside can support people who are on the inside. And I feel like you gave us so many resources and ways to do that, and just the power and energy to know that we can do it. So thank you. So we still have about 15 minutes for questions. I see, first of all, thank you everyone for your engagement in the chat. I've loved reading where everyone is coming in from and what your interests are, and seeing some of those questions come in. So one question that we have that I'll pose to the panel, whoever kind of feels like they want to take it, is how do we reconcile reliance on the law for empowerment when most laws are made to facilitate the carceral state's racial structures? And how should we distinguish between good laws and bad laws? And what should the distinction be if so? So that's a big question, but does anyone want to take any part of that?
Sure. I will try to sum it up and do it really, really simple. Vote. We have an election coming up in just a couple of months. That's probably the most important election in all of our lives. And I mean, that is one way. You know, one of the other ways where we can start to work at this entire system and everything as a whole is we have to do away with that idea that resources is always the answer. You know, I keep hearing people and organizations and politicians time and time again is we would like to do this, but we don't have the resources. I think that's crap. I think that's BS. If you look at each and every one of these panelists that have participated today, you look at what the common denominator is. Each and every one of us started from on the inside and we didn't have resources. And we are continuing to do the work on the outside, and most of us don't have the resources. The thing that we do have is heart. It's heart in each and every one of the attendees and everyone out there, I think that's the biggest component. And that's not to diminish the value of resources. Yes, resources are important, but I'll take my organization, for example, the Texas Jail Project. We have three employees, only one of which is full-time, and we reach across the entire state of Texas. You know, my former executive director, Diana Clater, this woman has heart. This woman will fight you tooth and nail. If there is an injustice, if there is something wrong, she will fight you tooth and nail without resources. And I think that's the biggest thing. So, you know, we just have to do away with all these old ideals and everything. I mean, get out there and vote. Use what you do have, you know.
I think what I would add to that is that legal empowerment isn't just about having jailhouse lawyers, right? Legal empowerment is like what Kevin said, it's voting. It is about, you know, doing legislative advocacy, going to your city council meeting, talking to the people who represent you, being in the room at the table whenever there's a decision that's going to be made about policy, bringing the people that policy is going to impact and letting them have a say, bringing them into the room, making sure that they have the knowledge that they need, connecting them to the places and spaces that they need to have access to, so that people can have a clearer understanding of the ways in which those policies are going to impact our community. And so, you know, thinking about laws as good or bad, you could spend a lot of time in that little ideological place. But the answer is that we have to be involved in our community, and legal empowerment looks like a lot of different things, but mainly it is just being involved.
Something I would like to add, I mean, after Lauren and Kevin both said amazing things. So I wanted to just name that, you know, being an attorney costs on average like $100,000 to $150,000 to go through college and law school. And an attorney in Texas, the average attorney makes is $150,000 a year in Texas. Much more other places. So when you talk about legal empowerment, also be very aware that you're talking about decommoditizing by making publicly, you're talking about making an open source, a way that a lot of powerful people make a lot of money every year. And so not every attorney is a friend of legal empowerment. And I want to name that here. Here in Travis County, we fought very hard to finally establish a public defender's office, chief public defender's office. You would think that every criminal defense attorney would support that, but every criminal defense attorney doesn't necessarily have in their minds and hearts and actions the best interests of everyone in need of a criminal defense attorney. People are not necessarily interested in deconstructing the systems in which they have invested time, energy, and money, truly invested with the goal of it paying returns and dividends later on. So I know that we all on this panel, all of my friends, my homies here, we know some attorneys who are willing to put in the work to demystify everything that they bill for. But not every attorney is trying to do that. And so that's something I want to name. When we talk about diminishing our dependence upon this siloed concept of access to legal knowledge and resources. And I do want to say this about resources. I think the term resources is a relative term. It's very subjective. And I think if we all had shared language about resources, to recognize that we are never out of resources. Jody put something in the chat box about, you know, resources are important when you A, know they exist, and B, know how to use them, I believe is what she put. And we all have resources, but the system in which we all exist teaches us that our time is not a real resource because it's our time, or our experiences are not commoditized resources. But everyone here has proven you can take experiences of the incarceral state and turn them into a salary. These are things that people don't know. So people don't know that. And I saw someone in post talking about like, we need to challenge the law of parties. Okay, perfect example. So if my child is ever arrested for anything, but let's just say law parties as an example. Because I've been in that beast, I'm going to fight hook, crook. I may have to quit if my job wasn't doing this, I would have to quit my job to do this to save my son's life. Because the system will kill him. It will peel my daughter from her bones and leave her soul exposed bare. Because I've seen it happen to people. Jody's seen it, Lawrence, Kevin, we've seen this happen to people. Jason, we've seen people go in and come out and have the light gone from their eyes. So if my child is imprisoned in an unjust and unfair way, which is any way possible in my opinion, I have to dedicate everything I have to undo that. And so that means I'm gonna have really awkward conversations with people. That neighbor who never wants to talk about that, I'm gonna have this conversation and it's gonna be a line drawn in the sand. That's the kind of commitment I will have to have for my kid, and I will have to do it praying to God that there are people like Jody and Savannah and Kevin and Lauren and Jason, and I saw like Diana's on here, people that I know that are doing this work. I know my teammate Alicia is listening to this. I would need to know that there are people like them, people like me who aren't me out there to pick up this slack when I, as a singular person, am trying to save someone's life because I love them. And that's a lot to hope for and expect. But if we are serious about flipping the system, if we are serious about tearing apart all the ways that the system treats us like money and yet treats us as though we mean nothing at the exact same time, then people are going to have to be willing to find a new profession in the name of justice and equity and destroy some relationships and maybe build some new ones in the name of justice and equity. Because everyone's real curious about what we're going to do about X, Y, and Z when that applies to someone they know. The problem is getting everyone in this world, but especially on this panel and on this call today, to remember the groups to which their loved ones do not belong when they're talking about what equity and justice should look like.
I think we have time for another question. So one question that I see here in the chat is, how and where could folks begin with abolitionist thinking, feeling, or dreaming? And that's from Orlando.
Can you repeat that one more time, Savannah?
Yes, of course. It is, how and where could folks begin with abolitionist thinking, feeling, and dreaming?
You know, for me, and that's a tough question. Like that was a question that I personally had to answer for myself. And I think that's one of the healthiest ways to approach abolition, learn about it. But at some point you have to make a choice that first, I am an abolitionist at abolition, and I know what that means to me. And so like, even when I speak into the movement, I can confidently speak as a legal empowerment practitioner, and that's what I'm sewing into the movement. So I'm conscious of it, but I'm also myself within it. And for me, one thing I really hope to, in addition to bringing, you know, awareness to jailhouse lawyers and legal empowerment, you know, my goal for abolition is that people see that the movement on the outside cannot and will not be successful if it's not connected first to the movement inside. There is a whole community. When I talk about community, I first immediately go to prison. My mind was blown away at the amount of people living their lives. Even a person serving a life sentence is living a whole life inside of the prison. And so we can beat and we can scream and we can fight as much as we can on the outside, but how we connected that movement from the inside. And there's not too many healthy ways to get into a prison. You know, you have to be very skillful on how you get in. And as we pointed out, it's also how you come out. And for me, thinking about abolition and a legal empowerment lens allows me to see law libraries as an entry point. And it allows me to see, we say those closest to the problem are those closest to the solution. When we look at just the number of people that go in and out, whether it's one day, a year, 5 years, 10 years, you know, you're in there. And that law library is a place that most people go through, whether a good experience or a bad experience. So how are we, first of all, getting close to the people? Jailhouse lawyers are right there with the people. How are we? What are the entry points? And, you know, really having that thinking. Abolition is a process, it's a strategy. And so I really just encourage us, I encourage everybody, because it can be very matter of fact with the abolition movement sometimes, as well as you could do all the planning you want. But if there's not somebody from the inside, if there's not somebody who's directly impacted by the injustice that your abolition is attached to, a part of that, then I mean, all of it is an idea and a dream. And I think we have to really look at proactive ways that we can, we have to look at abolition proactively and not just as a reaction.
So we are just right about to be at 5:30 Central Time. So we'll just start wrapping up, but this conversation is continuing, it's ongoing, it doesn't live on Zoom, it doesn't live on YouTube Live, it doesn't live in any room, it lives with all of us, and we hope to continue this conversation. I'm sending in the chat the form again to fill out if you'd like to stay involved in legal empowerment work. And so if any of our panelists have need for people to kind of support their work in any way, your names and information will be on this form and we'll be able to reach out to you. But again, this is the continuation of a conversation that's been happening already for a long time. Like our panelists have said, it is happening behind bars, it's happening here, it's happening everywhere, and it'll keep spreading with everyone joining in the conversation. So thank you so much for joining in today. Thank you again to our co-sponsors. Thank you for everyone working behind the scenes, typing those closed captions, posting the things that I post here onto the YouTube Live, the people who designed the poster, who made the art for the poster. It takes a community to do anything like this, and that's the beauty of it. So thank you for joining us today, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you, panelists.
I know.